Behold, my glorious supporter Darth Monkey 03 has asked me to discuss ambient life being added to tile sets. So Darth Monkey asks, how do you feel about adding in more non-combat NPCs to Warframe, like how Earth has the spine rats and birds? So I'm calling these ambient life NPCs, I guess. Personally, I am not excited about the prospect of this only because of the state that Warframe is currently in. So I want to preface my little discussion of this by saying that I really want them to just work on the game. There are some games that I've played where I think almost arguably the most the game could improve is by making the world just even more of what it is. So, for example, in Hades, Hades is a roguelite, a sort of dungeon crawler game with this really interesting way of weaving story in. In a game like Hades, and again, I'm sorry if this is not a good example, but games like maybe Diablo, those kinds of games. Games like Hollow Knight is another good example. It's not the same genre. Games like that. In these games, I think that if you took the state of the game now and you said, what would improve this game the most, or like among the most of anything you could add, I think that adding little touches, like little ambient life touches, is arguably up there. It adds a lot. Like if you're going through that same area and there are all these environmental things you could interact with and could have these little touches there, that does add a lot. It just feels very nice. You're sort of in this immersive world. It's not really adding gameplay content necessarily, although it can, like adding the really quick little fishing minigame in Hades, for example. It's not really adding gameplay exactly, but it really adds to the feeling of being in that world. So I think it's arguable that those things are up there. For Warframe, on the other hand, I really don't think that. I feel like it's partially, but not entirely, because the game is just not in a good place in a lot of ways. There's just so much that could be done so quickly that I'm really remiss to encourage adding these subtle touches that take a lot of time and are really works of art and can be really beautiful when they come out nicely, but don't add to or help repair, fix, robustify the main gameplay loop. I just don't think that that's what Warframe would benefit from right now. I think that if they put out an update like that, what players would say is, I resent that they put that in rather than like trying to put raids back in or trying to even more simple things. Like I would say, you're not willing to type in one number differently to fix the balance of viral, but you're willing to pay a bunch of graphic design artists to make these 3D models and spend like months integrating them into the environment, but you won't just type like three numbers to fix a bunch of game balance in like 1 second. Now, obviously, those things are not equivalent, but I wouldn't really say that. I would understand they just don't care about that, which is how I feel. But my point is that it just doesn't feel good to the player base too. The other thing I feel about this, the reason it's not partially but not entirely because Warframe's just in a janky place, is because I feel like it doesn't resonate with the player base. I feel like a lot of people are not really playing Warframe because it's so pretty, even though it is a pretty good looking game at times. Railjack looks awesome. Like a lot of the game looks awesome. Fashion Frame, this is like one of the better like wear your fashion as the end game games. Like I've played a lot of games where that is a big part of the drive at the end of the game, and Warframe is just like, oh, like there are problems, but like the way you can get yourself to look is just exciting. Like it's fun and different and has a lot of self-expression and can be many different styles, and I just think it's really cool. And so it's not that, don't misunderstand me and think that I'm saying the game being pretty is not part of the appeal of Warframe. I think it is, but I guess I feel that it's more like a lot of people, not necessarily me, not necessarily you, but a lot of people, I think, they're more interested in this appeal of like, you look like a badass rather than like, it's not immersion. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, it's not about it being immersive necessarily. I think that power fantasies in general are not very immersive. You know what I mean? Like, any game where, like, you are very powerful. Now, remember, a power fantasy, that term gets thrown around a lot. That does not mean, like, you instantly annihilate everything with a snap of your fingers. That's not a fun power fantasy. Power fantasy is just it's like a David and Goliath situation. You are a lot stronger than all of your enemies individually, like, broadly speaking. So, for example, like Destiny 2, even though it, many times through its life cycle, and I'm not a Destiny 2 player, has modulated how powerful you are, that game is still unarguably a power fantasy. Like, you are very powerful compared to an individual one of your opponents. By contrast, the game like maybe The Division 2, I would argue is kind of not, or at least much less of a power fantasy. One of your opponents poses a significant threat to you, like they can really kill you. Warframe is a power fantasy, and so I do think that that is inherently less immersive when you are, even from a practical standpoint, when you are deleting the whole map of enemies, or you can potentially, you're cleaving through 10 enemies at once. It's just not as valuable to have like a little ambient detail you can notice, like the rat or the bird in the environment. Do I think that means they're meaningless? No, not at all. I think that there are a lot of little ambient touches that I like. I like there being little decorations hidden in the environment, like the Curia collecting thing is something I'm not personally into or excited about, but I do think it's kind of a fun little thing. I think having there be little rooms throughout the tiles where you can just break some containers and get some materials. I wish they gave you more materials. I've always kind of felt like you should get rewarded more for doing that, like going out of your way to do that, however little time it takes you. But I do like that as just a feature. Like, you're on a ship, there are gonna be storage rooms with items in them that you can go steal. That's just it's like a little ambient thing, but I do like that. I think there are parts of the game other than just cleaving through enemies that matter, don't get me wrong. I just feel like that type of ambient detail, like a lot of that in the environment, just the normal tiles, I don't think that adds a lot to the game because that's not part of the game's core gameplay loop or goal. I think that what is better is something Warframe already does really, which is to focus those details into the cinematic quests and to put more in there, to put more little things in there. I think it would be interesting to take this question where I think it would benefit the game the most, to add more ambient kind of distractions or side things into the quests that we get. Make the quests less linear. The game is already, missions are usually pretty linear, and I'd be interested to have the quests be more like, to use examples I was just using, a world in Hollow Knight, or I'm imagining like Banjo and Kazooie levels, where there are side things to go find and uncover, and they don't necessarily benefit you that much. They're just there as the thing you can experience, because when you're in a cinematic quest in Warframe, that is part of the gameplay loop. That's the goal of that piece of content, is to be immersive in some way. So I feel like there it is much more appropriate, and adding more detail to those things. They've added a lot. The cinematic quests are beautiful, but adding more stuff like that to those would be really good. To sort of end my discussion of this with something I didn't really talk about that much, but I was thinking of answering. I just don't think it's as useful to talk about for 10 minutes as what I had to say about that. I also feel like Warframe has this odd, not really problem, but there is something like a little not exactly right in my mind, where, like a lot of games of its ilk, the world feels a little bit too unpopulated by life. You know what I mean? When I was first playing Warframe, and this was a while ago, but not a lot of it has changed, a lot of this experience, I was kind of under the impression there were like borderline no humans that were not Grineer clones or Corpus or infested. There was like practically no one, And then when we found, like, in Chains of Harrow, you meet a group of humans. In the Glass Gambit, you meet a group of humans, or you learn about groups of humans. I was excited but kind of confused, because I felt like, there is this like this one surviving colony, but like, no, there are loads of organizations like this. We just don't know what they are, basically. And again, they might discuss them more deep in the codex, but as I have said before and will say again, that doesn't really count as part of the main game. You can go read about it, someone knows about it, but that doesn't mean that it's part of the core gameplay experience. It isn't. So the game doesn't get credit for things that are written deep inside of, you have to go scholarly dig them up. That doesn't mean they're not interesting, doesn't mean I don't enjoy those details. It's better that they exist than that they don't, but they're not part of the core gameplay experience because they're not incorporated into the core gameplay experience. They're off to the side, so that's that. I guess that's how they feel about them. I don't know. I think they should be incorporated more. If the world is full of these different people, like, I want to learn about them. Recently, I was playing The Elder Scrolls Online with a couple of friends just to try it out, and it's exactly the opposite of that, where like you go into the world and it's like, I already don't remember all of the different entities that I've learned about in the first like hour. And that's not a bad thing, I don't think. It's a fantasy world. Like, where are we? You know? And I think that for Warframe, it's made even worse by like, it's not an open world game. You are doing single missions that you approach from space. You're in space, you know, the hub world is in space. Even going to like Cetus and Fortuna, it helps a little, but it doesn't help that much, because when you go into those open world spaces, when you go into the Orvalis, when you go into Plains of Eidolon, they do feel fairly empty. And I don't think that's like a core problem for the game, but I just wanted to point out that I I do think it would take more than just some ambient life here and there to really change that part of the game, but I don't think that's a thing it wouldn't benefit from changing. I feel like I gave the impression for most of this answer that I don't really think it is that valuable to the game to change that, but I want to clarify that if, let's say that you're the you're the content director for Warframe, and you tell me we are going to add more ambient life to the game. This is a thing we're going to do. It's happening already. I would say you're going to have to add a lot, basically. Like, you need to do quite a bit for it to really feel like the world is quite empty. Like, people will notice little signs of life here and there, but you're going to have to add a lot of stuff to convince me that the world isn't just vacant, you know? Another big thing that would help, for example, would be if during missions you occasionally encountered third parties that were not part of the mission, like are not specifically sent to kill you. Like, it feels like there's nothing going on except us being, you know, in the environment. And there are a lot of passive systems. There are a lot of things like invasions and such that do happen while we're not there, but they don't feel enough. They don't feel present enough. And there is some theater that is needed there to make it feel like occasionally the player will just happen upon the Corpus and the Grineer having a fight, not because it's a crossfire exterminate, just because they're having, like, they are disputing in that area, you know? Again, this would take a lot of time, and I don't think it is high on the priority list for things that would improve Warframe, but I think it is interesting. I don't think it would have no valuable effect. I guess what I would say is, unless that was going to become a major focus that they wanted to dig their teeth into, I feel like Warframe is not primarily that game except during cinematic quests, and that's where I'd like to see that stuff added. I hope that makes sense. Thank you for asking me if I want more aminals in my Horde shooter, because I do overall. I just want them to be in the place that they'll get to have the spotlight for a bit the most. I hope that makes sense.